1. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com roundtable powered by TechStrong Learning. My name is Jared, and I'd like to welcome and thank all of you for joining our learning session today. We've got an exciting panel ahead, but before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping notes. Today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or would like to share with your team, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude today's program. You'll get a link in your email, or you can go to devops.com. If you have any questions, we'd like you to submit them in the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. You'll also see that's where the chat tab is if you want to engage with our speakers, send messages to other members in the audience, and you can see that some people are already messaging in there, which is great. Finally, at the conclusion of the program, I will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around and see if you're a winner. Let's go ahead and kick off today's program, Site Reliability Engineers. And today I'm joined with Ganesh Datta, CTO and co-founder of Cortex, Jeff Schnitter, Solutions Architect at Cortex, Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer at TechStrong Group. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to you, Mike. Go ahead and kick us off.
All right, great. Thanks, Jared. Hey, guys, good to see you both, as always. And I guess I want to get started with, if I go back in time, maybe 2 years ago, maybe even 3, I don't think anybody really knew what a site reliability engineer was or an SRE. And I wonder, I'm going to start with Ganesh, but have we reached a point where everybody kind of knows this? I mean, can I go to my mom and just say SRE and she'll know exactly what I mean? Or have we got to a point where, people understand this job function and what its role is and where it fits in the DevOps landscape? Where are we?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the perception and the scope of SRE is definitely increased. I think a lot more people know about it. I don't think our ounce would definitely know about it, but the great sign is our ounce would definitely know if DoorDash was down or Uber was down, which therefore is getting closer to the world knowing about SRE. And I think that's exactly the reason why I think it's become so much more appreciated, because I think organizations are starting to realize that, reliability is not just a nice to have. It's, a business critical requirement, not just for the enterprise, but for consumer applications and things like that as well. Even a minute of downtime can be thousands of orders lost. And so as they think about, hey, it seems important enough for us to be up all the time, they realize, oh, we should probably make that somebody's full-time job. And so, enter SRE. And I think there's becoming more of an appreciation of SRE's role in keeping systems afloat, keeping systems up, and helping the organization understand what it means to keep things up, because SREs can't do everything. It's really about that influence. And so I think there's definitely more of an appreciation than we saw even 3-4 years ago, which is awesome to see.
Jeff, do you want to add to that? I mean, are SREs still kind of maybe the new rock stars of DevOps, or are people kind of getting to the point where they just go, they nod their head and they go, yeah, I know what you do, welcome to the club, but you're not as special as you used to be.
No, they're definitely the rock stars. And I think SRE, the concept has existed for a long time, but we've just corralled it over the last couple of years. It's been spread out through multiple teams, maybe multiple functions. And to bring it into a single organized group where you're really taking a look at reliability, that's the big change I've seen over the last couple of years.
All right. Ganesh, what does it take to be an SRE? I think a lot of the folks who are watching this or probably have some other job title right now, and the reason they're zoning in on this is they're like, well, maybe I should call myself an SRE and give myself a raise somehow or other. But, what does it take from a skills perspective and even an attitude perspective to be an SRE these days?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I think one, having a calm presence of mind when things go down, being good at incident management type things. I think an SRE that freaks out and scares everyone else is probably not going to be very successful at the job. So it probably comes down to what you enjoy, and does that excite you to kind of be the point of contact when something does go down. But from a technical skill set, I think there's a lot of stuff that can really help an SRE excel. I think everything from kind of systems foundations to hey, do you understand Kubernetes to a level where you can kind of route things the right way? Do you understand reliability concepts? What does it mean to be up? How do we track those things? What kind of metrics should we be looking at? Do you know what metrics are and why metrics are important? Two, kind of system design architecture things as well. Understanding how systems interact, how systems should be interacting, what are failure modes, how do things break, how can things recover, and I think all those kinds of things are important. I see a question here around like SRE, not calling SREs rock stars in the chat, and I totally agree. And I think that's one of the reasons why we strongly believe that SREs should have the ability to understand system design and architecture, because the more you understand architecture, the more you can provide guidance upfront. So if you can be a developer's right-hand guide and say like, hey, here are the things you should be thinking about to make your systems reliable, it prevents the need for you to have to be a rock star when things go wrong. And so having that system design architecture mindset for an SRE can be very useful for them in their careers.
All right. Jeff, what do you make of that conversation? Because, are they, I guess in some ways you could say, or maybe they're incident junkies, right? They get on there's a crisis and they always get kind of jazzed up about that. But to the point of one of our attendees here, that may be the opposite of that. Maybe what we're really looking for is something that feels more like Zen and the art of IT, right? And trying to figure out how to be chill about everything. Is there a middle, or do you want to be left, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely get the comment, because if you are completely reliant on an SRE person to solve all the problems, that doesn't scale. So ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to build processes into the system that reduces that dependency on a single person or a single team to solve all of the problems. But I want to come back to the original question about what it takes to be an SRE. And I'm reminded of a recent conversation I had with a colleague who said that they used to be an ER nurse. And I found that there's a big correlation between working in an ER and doing SRE. And the big part of it is you don't know what to expect when you start every day. You can be very prepared, but you don't know where the emergency is going to be. And to Ganesh's point, that you do have to be calm under pressure. There's going to be crises that appear. You're going to have to be prepared to work on them. And it's a great skill set to have, to be able to be very broad across a wide scale of the product. And it's a great opportunity to learn a huge amount about the product.
All right. Ganesh, there's another question here that kind of goes to the heart of this issue as well. But basically, if somebody wants to know, well, what's the difference between what we just described and good old-fashioned technical support?
Yeah, I think there's when you think about the function, a function can be proactive and a function can be reactive. Right? Technical support is more reactive. Something goes wrong, file a ticket, or you escalate it to somebody gets paged, and you're reacting to something that's gone wrong. Right? You're helping the customer kind of remediate things or figure out a solution to their problem. Versus, SRE is both proactive and reactive. And ideally, as the SRE organization matures, the proactive side is becoming more important versus the reactive. You are helping your engineering teams understand processes to, better respond to things when they go wrong. You're helping them follow those best practices so that things don't go wrong in the first place, or you can quickly automatically remediate things. You're making things more robust and scalable. And so the proactive component is more important for SRE, is like that thought partner, the guide, and in some cases, the enforcer of things that are good. There is a reactive component to it. When things go wrong, the SRE can also be the point person there. But when you think about, hey, I'm being successful in my role as an SRE, you are really leaning on the proactive side of things. So that would be the difference between SRE and old-fashioned support is you're proactive, you are the thought partner and guide, versus, hey, I'm just helping fix very tactical things that are broken.
All right. Well, we have another question that kind of goes down the same path. I'm going to toss it to Jeff first, and then maybe Ganesh, you can weigh in behind it. But one of our attendees wants to know, all right, if that's the theory, what's a real life example of something that, how do I troubleshoot an incident, and what would an SRE do differently per se? So Jeff, I don't know if you want to, reach back in time and describe something you were working on first person, and then, with changing the names to protect the guilty, as it were. But,
We'll just say developer A was working on a problem that he caused, and it might have been me. But I think there's a relationship, just like Ganesh had talked about, between troubleshooting and SRE. And I think that I've found myself in this role before, where I actually don't know a whole lot about the product, but I'm responsible for it. Problem report comes in, so I now need to troubleshoot that. And what ends up happening is you either know about it and you might be able to know how to react to it, or you don't. So you're going to need to know where to find the information. Where do I find the team? Where do I learn about it? Where do I find the documentation? And then I think the correlation between that and SRE is you start to take a look at the queue as they start to come in. You get a lot of the same reports and you try to think, how can I be proactive about that? What can I do? What can I implement? Whether it's documentation, whether it's automation, whether it's standards. So you're trying to reduce that queue. And so there's a constant relationship, I think, between the two.
Ganesh, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think to Jeff's point, it's like once you start setting those standards in place around, hey, like services need to be monitored, we should have like uptime alerts and things like that. Then you start getting to a world where as an SRE, when there is an incident, you can follow a very clean procedure of like how to go and troubleshoot that. So it could be things from communications. So step one might be sending out the comms to the right people. Like, hey, we're aware of incident XYZ. This is the current impact. This is the severity that we see. And then you start troubleshooting. So it's like, hey, let me go check out my run books. Let me try out this run book that helps me assess the current status of the problem. Let me go back and communicate that. Then let's go look at our dashboards that we have. Let's go, escalate to the right people. And so once you start setting those building blocks in place, then you can follow a very streamlined process, starting from communication to triage to impact analysis to then actually remediation, or getting the remediation steps in the hands of the right people that can't do that. So that's why that standardization aspect that Jeff was talking about is so important.
Jeff, to that end, and let me just throw in this question. Historically, we've had these kind of idle processes where somebody generates a ticket and it works through the workflow, and that's how we manage the incident. Does that stuff go away in favor of a more programmatic approach with SREs, or is there some hybrid, or, how does, everybody's got idle somewhere in their background. How does that kind of mindset play in with being an SRE?
I think it's very similar to whether it's coming in over Slack or from a ticket-based system. For me, I'm always trying to work myself out of that job. How can I prevent myself from either getting that request, make sure it doesn't come in, or if it does come in, is there a way for me to easily handle it? Because anytime you have those manual touch points, you're going to become less efficient. I think you're always going to have those tickets that are going to come in. It's inevitable. You want to be able to track, you want to be able to measure, you want to be able to show how well you are doing with your support. But the key is to try to figure out, how do I cut them down? And if they are going to come in, how can I close them efficiently, both for me and my team who's working on them, and for the person who has that problem who had to open up that request.
All right. Ganesh, what do you think about that? Is there some hybrid relationship between these systems that we need to work on? Because I know sometimes people get into these religious conversations about one methodology versus another, but I'm kind of wondering if maybe we should just be running to the middle.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a cop-out answer, but it always depends on each organization, right? It's like, the more consistency and standardization you have, the easier it is to automate it. The more automation you have, the easier it is to drive consistency and standardization. And so there's some aspect of like finding tactical opportunities to drive that automation and standardization. There's certain things where it's like, it's just not worth the lift. So there's always, I think, going to be a push and pull, and hopefully you land somewhere in the middle for sure.
All right. To that point, we talked about being proactive. And Jeff, I'll throw this your way first, but it feels like, to me at least, too much of what we do ask people to do is a manual process still. Even in the most automated of so-called DevOps workflows, there are all kinds of manual bottlenecks that people wind up dealing with. So, what is the way to think about this more programmatically so I can be proactive and I'm not kind of waiting around for some ticket to solve every little thing that comes in?
Yeah, I think that's the big challenge. It's really seeing the forest for the trees, because you're often taking a look at individual tickets as they're coming in, and you have to take a look at what is the bigger picture. Why am I getting a collection of issues that are coming in? And I think a lot of it has to do with trying to keep up with standards. If you have different services that are being created different ways, I've seen this with larger organizations. Maybe you have a monolith that's being broken into microservices. So you're dealing with a monolith, you're dealing with microservices, you're dealing with different teams who have different ideas on how to implement those microservices. So the manual tasks often come into play because there isn't a standard way across the organization that you're doing particular tasks. And so this is where it becomes a challenge. It sounds easy to say, if you have standards, if you have a constant similar way where you create a new service, where your health endpoints are going to be reached, you can start to automate those things a little bit better. But it's a huge challenge to try to corral a large organization and try to do that.
Ganesh, any thoughts or advice as to how to go about solving this issue?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
I said, any thoughts or advice about how to make things more programmatic and a little more proactive versus an SRE just kind of waiting for the next incident to show up and responding?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple aspects to it. I think one, it starts from, and there's a question here around like, where should SRE be part of the product lifecycle, the development lifecycle? The more SRE can be partners to like platform engineers and cloud engineers and things like that, they can help bring their best practices earlier on into the life cycle. So you say, hey, let's make it really easy, when developers are spinning up a new project, let's make it so easy that they get these dashboards automatically. Like it just creates these dashboards for them. And so you build this automation into the very first parts of your SDLC, partnering with other functions across the organization. And as you start building that automation, that then makes the SRE's life easier when something does happen, because they can say, hey, I know exactly which dashboards are out there and what information is going to provide me, and I can go and resolve that. And eventually you can say, not only do I know what those dashboards are, I know how to start interpreting those metrics, and I can build automated playbooks and run books and things like that. And so I think it's starting small, starting from like as early in the SDLC as you can, and then working your way up the stack. That's how we'd recommend really thinking about the automation side of things.
All right, Jeff, a long time ago, I think Monty Python made the phrase "expect the unexpected" famous. I believe they were cribbing from Oscar Wilde back in the day. But how do you kind of, figure out what to expect or what to look for? Those dashboards that Ganesh talked about, seems to me you're trying to create a dashboard that covers a spectrum of things that are likely to happen. And so you're halfway to fixing them in anticipation. Is that kind of the art of being an SRE?
Well, it's interesting you use the word art, because as scientific as this industry is, it seems to always come down to the art, to see through all of that science, all of that data. You're asking, how do I expect the unexpected? It's going through and taking a look at the data that you've got. It's reflecting back on the requests that are coming in. And you have to end up trying to predict what you're going to see on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. And then I think you have to grade yourself against that. Did the predictions that I have actually come true, or was it something completely different? You end up seeing trends through your metrics, through your dashboards, through the requests that are coming in. And I think it becomes an art. You start to be predictive. You're trying to build as much tooling as possible to help guide you with that. But ultimately, I think there's that human aspect that comes into play to try to figure out what's going to happen next.
Yeah. Ganesh, there's a conversation happening on the discussion here, and it's about service level objectives. And as part of the art of being an SRE is to define those KPIs up front, because that kind of defines or ultimately is what people will measure you against for success or failure. So how do I go about creating something that is a KPI that is achievable, but it's still good enough for the business to manage the goal? Because it seems like a lot of times SREs are being held accountable for things that, may not be able to support because we never really had a reasonable SLO in the first place.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, when you think about SLOs, there's in some cases a lot of dogma and strongly held opinions around it, and there's lots of writing, and I think there's almost too much information. And so what I generally recommend for people is to kind of take a step back and start with the question, why are we trying to define SLOs? Like, what are we trying to solve? And I think for most organizations, assuming you're not directly impacting a certain SLA or some sort of legal agreement or what have you, your SLOs are to help individual teams understand where they're at from a reliability standpoint. And so when you think about the question that way, I think it makes it more reasonable to say, like, as an SRE, your goal should be to help injuring teams understand what they should be tracking to help themselves be better. And so like SRE is very much like an influence role as well. It's like you're getting all your teams to care about reliability. And so SLOs are a great way of doing that. And so, a simple thing that SREs might look at is like uptime, latency, and throughput metrics. So if you're not up 3 nines, then that's probably a bad thing. And so that can be a very standard SLO that everybody should track for their systems. But then helping individual teams define SLOs that are meaningful to them. And a very tactical example of this, at my previous job, I worked on a payment system for some time. And so, if payments were not going through, that would be a problem. And so your system could be up, but your payments are failing. And so our payment success rate was a very important metric. And so for our team, that was particularly meaningful. That's a great example of an SLO that you should probably track for yourself as a team, and then you can report against that and say, are we meeting our SLOs? At the end of the day, what our business cares about is, are payments actually going through? And if we're only hitting 80% of payments going through, we're not meeting our reliability requirements as a team. And so taking a step back and thinking about those kind of business objectives and how do you translate that into an SLO that you can take and then report on, that's kind of what SREs should be thinking about, not for themselves, but to help their partner teams go and think about.
Jeff, how does this conversation occur? Because we've been talking about on the side here with the Q&A in the chat about an SRE is a type of generalist. Okay, well, that's theoretically true. But now I have a crisis, and now I have all the people who are specialists in the room. How does that generalist kind of make themselves relevant? I would refer back to, there's an old joke about Ronald Reagan saying the most 9 dangerous words in the English language are, hello, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. Well, applies to centralized IT functions as well. So how do you kind of get in there and help?
The SRE is a generalist. The SRE, you want to make sure they have a really high level understanding of those components so they can speak to those teams, speak to how they are connected, definitely understand how they relate to the performance and the reliability of the product with the issues that they see coming in. So they have to be willing to listen. They have to be quick to understand how the components work together. And again, it's an art that you're often going to not know a part of that product. You end up getting tickets that come in, you get the opportunity to learn. And I think you start to build up that subset of knowledge that allows you to make that communication possible between those component owners.
Ganesh, do you think the SRE, in effect, is the institutional memory for the organization, because they're the ones that know where all the pieces are? So when there is a crisis, somebody has somebody that they can ask that says, this happened, how does this relate to all these other things that we're dependent upon? And maybe that's a big part of the function, is just to be that central repository of the knowledge.
100%. I totally agree with that. And I just got a question here on the side around, somebody who was in a cybersecurity position and then had now been moved into an SRE function. And so I think those functions have a lot of overlap. And the reason for that is there's that level of institutional knowledge where you've seen many things go wrong before, and you have almost that that trauma, if you will, from institutional challenges. And so you know how to take that knowledge and then become more proactive about it. So when you see issues happen, you see 3 incidents happen, you know how to better route it. Like, oh yeah, when this kind of incident happens, like these are the right people that should be in the room, or this is the severity or the impact, or I should treat it a certain way. But as you start seeing that, you start realizing, like, I've seen 3 incidents now because, there wasn't an alert for X, Y, and Z, and then we didn't catch it until a week later, and then it became a fire. And I hate fire. So I'm going to start pushing people now to set up alerts for that thing that we saw. And that's going to be part of my reliability toolkit that I'm going to go and convince people to do that. Then you're using your institutional knowledge in a more proactive way. The same way security teams say, oh, last time, we've gotten DDoS twice, and that's like a big problem. So let's make sure that our systems have circuit breakers, so we're not running into those kinds of issues from a security standpoint. We're not running into vulnerability package management things. So let's build package scanning into CI. And so you're taking like that institutional knowledge and translating into this proactive things. So yeah, absolutely agree that SRE is kind of a representation of the institutional knowledge and pain and trauma that they faced.
Jeff, how do we get the organization to buy into that? And using that fire metaphor, I'll tell you an old story. I was chatting this fellow up a while ago, and he was saying, he was asking me, we have this issue, that issue, what do you think about that? And I said, I'm in the content business, and we create all this content so you don't run into these issues. And he just looked at me and he said, son, it's really hard to think about fire prevention when you're holding on to a 10-inch hose for dear life. So, with that said, we have IT teams are trying to hold things together. There's bailing wire everywhere. Things have been stitched together. How do you take the moment in time to say, stop, we're going to not worry about the immediate burning down of the house to prevent the entire neighborhood from going up? How do we get to that mindset?
Yeah, it seems like the driver for that usually is some kind of chaotic event where you've had some kind of crisis, and then teams are starting to look at it. I think you want to make sure that SREs can present that big picture, whether it's overall health from components across the entire system, where you might say, listen, we had 3 critical incidents last week. We're taking a look at the service health for these services, and there can be a relationship there. And I think that if executives learn and they understand that you're trying to cut down on that churn, cut down on that fire, where you can go back and take a look at the overall service health, because there's a lot of metrics that come into that, whether it's your MTTR, whether it's your SLOs that you're trying to meet. You're trying to present that big picture and show how it reduces that overall crisis. It's difficult, I think, to make sure that people will invest in that. Often it is that crisis event that triggers it, but I think if you can show the overall health of those services across the board, you can help get that discussion going.
Ganesh, to Jeff's point, and to one of the questions here on the side, it's clearly a journey. You're not just going to flip a switch and say, oh boy, we got an SRE and away we go. But we have a question here about where to get started. There are lots of KPIs and lots of SLOs to think about. So what's your best advice in terms of what's doable kind of quickly and then grow from there?
Yeah, I think step one is understanding what is a charter of SRE at this organization. Is the charter of SRE, like, did your VP come to you and say like, oh, we have 2 nines and we got to get to 3 nines because every minute of downtime is costing us $1 million? Or is it, hey, reliability is starting to become more important. We are becoming an enterprise, and therefore reliability is affecting our customer experience. So let's start with that. Like, why does this function exist? And then you can start thinking about step one. How do I prevent things from going down? Or how do I prevent things? Like, think about it from kind of like a risk mitigation standpoint. What are the standards I need to get people to think about? How do we get people thinking about reliability, whether it's through communications, through visibility, through dashboards, through best practices, getting people to think about things. Start there. Very easy to start defining kind of checklists and guides and viewing yourself as a teacher. So like, that's one part of the job. The second thing is starting to institute process around the incident side of things. What happens when there is an incident? As an SRE, how can I be the most effective? Whether that's, bringing all your information together in a single place through, a single source of truth for, hey, here's all of our systems and ownership and on-call rotations. And when something goes wrong, I can quickly find the right person and send things their way. I think starting very small, starting with those building blocks is what I would recommend for people. Is like, don't try to do too much all at once. Figure out, what am I trying to solve and how do I, piece by piece get there through small processes, through small changes to the culture. That's, I think, how SRE organizations can be successful, especially when they're new.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, do we not take enough time to do the analysis of the incident after it's over? I think we're all happy when it gets resolved, but maybe we don't spend enough time to learn from this. And that's kind of a big part of the SRE's role, is, I would think, is to come in and do that forensics.
Yeah, I've been kind of disappointed in what I've seen over the course of my career, that a problem does come in, it's fixed, and then you move on. I've seen organizations say that every time that there's an issue, that you should make sure that you've got a unit test, system test, whatever, that will catch that problem again. I haven't seen that always be the case. So you really do want to have that postmortem to take a look at that incident. Why did it happen? What can we do to fix it? But we don't want it just to be a point fix for that individual problem. Is that more indicative of a larger issue that might be going on with the way that the product's being developed, whether the services, how they're talking together? And I think that should be part of that postmortem, not just that specific issue, but is it fitting into a larger general trend of issues that are happening?
Ganesh, you want to add to that? Are we just incapable of learning, or what's the deal?
No, I think Jeff summarized it. I think it's not so much an incapability to learn as it is some lessons are just learned the hard way. And I think as a function, as an engineering, I think we're definitely maturing. All things considered, this kind of production cloud engineering is a pretty new thing, and so there's a lot of institutional function knowledge that we're just growing slowly. And I think, like, to your very first question around, like, do more people know about SRE today? I think so, and I think it's because we're starting to learn these lessons and it's starting to permeate more.
Jeff, we have a question about this. It kind of flows naturally from this, but where does this SRE function fit in the DevOps workflow? Or some folks are throwing around the phrase platform engineering these days, which may be a centralized flavor of DevOps. But what's your sense of where does this SRE person sit?
Yeah, Mike, I was going to try to take over your role because I was going to interview Ganesh on this question, because I think it's a great one. I myself am kind of confused on the overlap between SRE and DevOps. I come from a history of the waterfall development will work on the code for a long time, and it just went over the wall and it went to an operations team. And so then we said, you know what we need? We need DevOps. So DevOps is, we're going to encapsulate a lot more of that production environment, the development environment in the code. Docker came along, Kubernetes came along, and now you were starting to codify that ability to create the development environment. So you weren't really throwing it over the wall, but I think it's still getting thrown over the wall. The wall's just a little bit shorter now. So what ends up happening is DevOps is that ability for the application teams to have part of that development packaged up in the application, but you still have SRE. So I'm going to interview you, Ganesh, and say, what have you seen where you've got DevOps and the idea is that you're breaking up monoliths, you got microservices, those development teams own the whole life cycle. At least that's what we're saying, and that's what DevOps is. So why do we still have the SRE role? If the idea was each of the microservices would fully own the life cycle, where does SRE fit in?
It's a great question. And honestly, I think there's been a lot of movement in this space generally. We're seeing all kinds of new functions. And Mike, you alluded to this as well. Like there's platform engineering, there's cloud engineering, there's developer experience, there's developer platform. It's just like all these like new things popping up. And I think there's a lot of overlap between those. And so I dropped it in the chat here, but the way I like to think about it is DevOps is about making it easy to build and release things. So like, can we make things easily Dockerized, pipelines, tooling, production processes, those kinds of things are what we see, DevOps engineers really focusing on. How can I make it very easy for that thing to get into production? SRE is thinking about, should this thing be going into production? Like, what should it be doing to get into production? So it's more of like that operational mindset of, hey, how do I make sure that, DevOps has made it really easy to get this thing into prod. It's one click and it's going to go to prod. But when it goes there, how do I reduce its blast radius? How do I make sure it should even be in production in the first place? What are the standards that should be following before it gets there? And so SRE is more around like that operation. Let's make it easy to run in production. DevOps has helped us get it there, but now we're going to take it from there. And that's where like that partnership comes in. And platform engineering is kind of like that as well. But platform engineering is building those kind of cloud foundations, right? They're building the foundation that DevOps is building on top of, that SRE is then building on top of. So platform is like your Kubernetes clusters, your tooling, your CI/CD cluster, like the stuff that then DevOps is going and building on top of. So it's kind of like your layers of networking, or all the different pyramids that you can think of. Platform is kind of at the bottom, and each thing has a function. And that's why that partnership is so important, because if SRE is coming at the very end of the life cycle and saying like, oh my God, like you got to be doing these 10 things before you go into a Kubernetes cluster, your platform engineering team hasn't thought about that, then there's a disconnect. So usually what's happening is your SRE is going back to your platform engineering team and saying, hey, can you make sure that we're instrumenting our clusters with X, Y, and Z, and we're adding these sidecars, and you're making that easy for the DevOps team. And the DevOps team is then being asked to say, hey, before when you build your Docker image, can you make sure it's attaching our APM agent and connecting to Prometheus? And so by the time it gets to SRE and production, everything is flowing really smoothly. And so that's kind of the differences in how we see all those teams really pairing together to get something into production and then be reliable from there on out.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, to your earlier point, though, and it kind of comes full circle, and there's a question here in the panel that kind of alludes to some of this, and it's kind of a loaded question, so I'm letting you know it's come. But you were describing how disappointing you were that we don't, capture enough of this data, and we don't have enough stuff to work from to learn and to kind of make adjustments from these incidents. And I would argue that humans being who we are, nobody wants to be held at fault for something going wrong. So there's an inclination not to capture that data in the first place, because we're just trying to solve the issue of the day and we don't want to leave an evidence trail per se. So do we need, to have a different mindset about the way we manage IT altogether? Because so many organizations you work in go into, everybody's kind of a little bit on edge because, if something goes wrong, there's going to be a meeting somewhere that they're going to be called into account for.
That's a great question. My experience hasn't been that we're trying to avoid it. It's not that we're not trying to capture it. I think teams are so busy that they aren't necessarily prioritizing the postmortem and making sure that they've got the continuous feedback loop that they're working into. And I think this whole ecosystem is tied together. You talk about having too many manual tasks. You don't have enough automation. You don't have enough standards. And I think that's why people perhaps get the fix and they're going right on to the next thing. So I think when we try to look at a issue as being single pointed, like let's say we're not doing enough continuous improvement on taking a look at the failure, look at the bigger picture. What is the entire development ecosystem? Why are we in this case where we feel like we're always fighting fires? And I think you have to look at that piece of it in order to take a look at a smaller piece, which is how are we doing the postmortems? How are we managing that? I would hope that teams that I've worked with in the past are really trying to fix their own problems, that they're trying to take a look at their own SLOs and improve them on their own without needing people to come in and tell them that you have to do a better job. I know that I always want to work on other stuff. I don't want to work on taking a look at the same problems coming in. I don't want to have to go to a postmortem meeting. So let's make sure that the services are resilient, taking a look at my own metrics and trying to fix them as they go. So I don't know how to encourage that from other teams where I haven't seen it be the case, but I think it does come down to just the constant firefighting mode. You got to back up and take a look at what are the causes of that and try to fix that bigger macro problem.
The other thing I'll add to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I would add to that is I think that's one of the reasons why things like SLOs are so important, is because it helps you kind of encapsulate the impact of not doing those things into some easily digestible numbers. So you can go back and say like, hey, we agreed, that our uptime is 99.9. They're like, yep. But we have all this tech debt and stuff we're doing from our postmortems that we're not fixing. Like, yep. Well, we're not going to hit our SLOs if we don't go fix those things. And so now you're having a more informed, data-driven conversation about those things that you're assigning from postmortems, because I think, and a lot of the people on this webinar can probably relate, come up with all these things. There's so many things you want to fix, but, your product managers are, breathing down your necks with the next 40 things you got to release to production and the new features and the business lines and all this stuff. So how do you advocate for the stuff coming out of postmortems to then be prioritized as important as things in your product backlog? The way to do that is to have very tangible, concrete things that you've all agreed upon as being the definition of good, whether that's an SLO, whether that's scorecard, some combination of the above. I think those are the things that I think are really important, and it lets you have those conversations. So you can go back to your PM and say, hey, we agreed on this. Let's go prioritize those things so it just doesn't happen again. And then you're speaking the same language.
All right. I personally vote for IT Amnesty Day. Once a year, everybody gets together and says, all right, yeah, we screwed this up. It's okay. And we're moving on. All right. Jeff, how do you prevent burnout in this role? Because there are so many incidents and there are so many issues that you're going to encounter, and it can get stressful if you're constantly on edge all the time. So it seems like the turnover rate in this role could be quite high. So how do we kind of protect the mental health of the SREs?
Mike, that's a loaded question. My quick answer is I don't know, because I think this is one of the roles that does have the greatest burnout rate. Mm-hmm. You're on call basically 24/7. You're responsible for the entire pipeline, the service that's going on. So to be able to reduce that burnout, you're going to have some kind of off time. So the team has to work together. I think you have to make sure that people aren't on call all the time. If on call is a big part of it, you have to reduce that on-call rotation. That's difficult with small teams where you see that people are on call every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. It helps if there's a bigger team. I think the organization has to invest in that role. They have to realize that those people are really going to understand the pain points and where changes need to be made. So there has to be buy-in from the organization to listen to what SREs have to say about where the pain is and to be willing to make investment, whether that's people or tools or processes that can help make things work better. But I'll go back to my original answer, which is I don't know. This is a very challenging role.
Ganesh, you want to add to that? I mean, I could think of maybe we need, SRE therapy sessions.
Is that a postmortem? No, I totally agree. I think it comes down to incident noise, like Jeff said, is a big one. I think one of the things that I was particularly opinionated on, back in the day was if there's an incident that wakes me up in the middle of the night, that's number one priority. I don't care what the PM thinks. It's like, we can't be waking up people in the middle of the night for no reason. And if something does, you got to fix that first and foremost. I think just, understanding that SREs are people too. And we want our good night's sleep and, that kind of stuff is really important. I think the other thing, like Jeff mentioned, is that top-down buy-in, constant visibility, hey, reliability matters. It's not just, oh, we hired an SRE team and they're going to figure it out. So, good luck. But having that buy-in from leadership to say, reliability is really important, and here's what we're doing to improve it, and here's what the SRE team's current focus is. I think that can really help as well. And then providing clarity to SRE on what their focus is. I think, a lot of times what happens is there's just like this top down, oh, go fix everything. But it's like, what we talked about earlier, what exactly are you trying to fix right now? Like, what is the most important thing? Like, is it just basic observability? Is it, increasing from 3 nines to 4 nines? Like, what is the one focus for the SRE function? If you could pick, out of the 10 things that matter, I think that kind of clarity, helps SREs make sense of the noise and be very thoughtful about what they're focusing on. So yeah, I think that kind of focus matters for SREs and everyone else, but SREs in particular.
Jeff, as part of that, I think part of the stress just comes from there's so many alerts. There's alert storms every time something goes off, and it's usually the root cause of something has generated 400 alerts that are by 500 systems or whatever it may be. And then as part of the whole conversation, there's no shortage of data. The issue is not that we don't have enough data. It's just that we can't make enough sense of the data. So how do you kind of get your arms around all this stuff in a way that allows you to do something meaningful? Because right now it's a little overwhelming.
Yeah, I'd like to amend my I don't know answer just a little bit. And if resources aren't an issue, I think one of the most critical things organizations can do is have follow the sun support, where you have geographical locations where you don't necessarily have to have that on-call presence. Now, that's not always going to be a viable alternative, depending on the resources they have access to. But I really think that teams have to look at that, because to be able to ring people and get them out of bed, that is a huge part of the burnout. So that's one thing that I want to be able to do. And then to your question about all of the noise, Mike, that's the challenge. And it's a constant push-pull, because you're alerting too much. So then you turn down those alerts a little bit, and what happens? Some kind of an issue pops through. So I think there's this constant analysis that needs to happen with the alerts. When people say, well, I didn't listen to that channel, or I didn't look at that issue that was created, because we see that all of the time. I think that's another case where it's an art, where you're constantly looking at that data. You're trying to figure out, of those alerts, how many of them were actionable? Can I start to give some percentages on when the alert came in, I had to do something and I had to fix it? So you actually need monitoring of your monitoring, I think, to take a look at, you're just spitting out all of this raw data. Who's looking at that data, making sense of it? Because anybody can create alerts. But how do you take a look at and make it meaningful? I put someone on that role to make sure that they're doing that analysis.
All right, Ganesh.
Yeah, and I think
just to follow up on that, and we have a question here, and I want to just note we got like 42 minutes before this topic came up, but can we apply artificial intelligence to save ourselves from ourselves with all these alerts and make sense of all this data? What is the state of the art right now from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's definitely more AI tools coming up in this space, and it's probably actually a good connection to the previous answer. I think in some cases there's this tendency to overcomplicate the processes that we should be following. Right. It's like there's all this noise. I think, AI can probably help us make some sense of that noise. Will help us do root cause analysis. Probably not anytime soon, but can help us understand, like, hey, we're seeing trends in certain areas. We're seeing issues and, these kinds of incidents. Like, those are things I think an AI can probably help you make sense of your world. But at the same time, I strongly recommend not overcomplicating things. Like the one thing I always like to talk about is like this concept of input and output metrics, right? Like your output metrics are your SLOs, your uptime, your DORA metrics, all the things that we think about as like, oh, we're tracking these things on big dashboards and executives are looking at them. But the other side of that is input metrics. So it's like outputs are we seeing the impact of what we're doing? And then inputs are we doing the things we should be doing? I think most SRE functions, 90% of SRE organizations should be thinking about the former. Are we doing the things that we should be doing? And then are we seeing the impact of that on the outputs? And so I think where AI can really help is like that outputs. Like, are we seeing trends? Are we seeing impact? Are we seeing correlations across different metrics? Are we seeing that, teams that are deploying more frequently are running into less incidents? I think those are the kinds of things where I think AI can help. But, the other side of it, like, are we doing the things we should be doing? I think that's where like humans and simple automation can probably help. And I think most functions should probably be focused on that before getting too crazy with AI and ChatGPT or what have you.
There you go. Jeff, under the heading of keeping things simple, it seems to me half the battle is just letting the folks know who are creating the issues that they're creating an issue, because if I'm a developer, I don't normally see a lot of the things that our operations folks may see, and I don't realize that this thing that I'm doing is aggravating a certain kind of situation before somebody calls me up. So, I mean, we have self-service for almost everything in the world, and we have portals for developers now. How do we kind of get the information that the SRE is collecting out to somebody who's going to do something that's actionable on that data?
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm reminded that I believe Einstein said everything should be as simple as possible and no simpler. And really to bounce on to Ganesh's response, you're taking a look at wanting to make sure you don't have these huge complex processes. In some ways, what we do is pretty simple. And I don't want to oversimplify this by saying you've got code, you're building code, you're sending it to production, you're monitoring it. You want to make sure that it works okay. Conceptually, we understand those things. Now, to make sure that you're performant and you're reliable and your 3 nines, all of those things, then it starts to get more complex. So you have to take a look at the simplest things that you can do, the requests that come in from development to SRE, how they respond to them. I really echo what Ganesh has to say. Don't over-architect it. Keep it as simple as possible and start to iterate over that simple solution that you've got. And then if that's not working, then you go from there. So if it's something as simple as let's say a Slack channel that you're going to take issues there, fine. Well, you can't monitor that after a while. You don't have the metrics. So maybe that moves on to an issue tracker. You start to measure things there. But I'm a big fan of what they call the skateboard development cycle, where you don't build the car initially. You build the skateboard first and you iterate over that. You build the scooter and then you build the bike and you go from there. So don't analyze the whole thing and try to build the car initially. Take small steps and build that way.
All right. Ganesh, I'm going to circle back to some of the questions we didn't get to, but one of them, and a lot of them actually come back to just, specific advice for tools and processes. But one of them is, are there tools that you like for capturing the incident so that you can do a post-mortem? Is there things that you've seen out there that are kind of make that process a little bit easier? Because it all starts with, if you can't see it, you can't measure it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a bunch of things that I think we see in the space. I think starting, and I'll break it down into kind of categories of tools. So category 1 is like basic visibility, like observability, right? Whether that's your Datadogs, your Grafana, Prometheus stacks, or New Relics, or what have you. I think making sure you have some sort of observability platform in play is super important. So that's kind of step 1. Step 2 is your alerting. So if something goes wrong, how are you going to know something went wrong? You can start with probably Slack alerts if uptime isn't super important for you, or Teams or whatever kind of chat ops you're using. But also like a PagerDuty or Opsgenie or those kinds of tools are super important, and they even have other kind of incident management tools in there. The third piece of that is, and this is kind of what Cortex, where we work, does, is kind of the best practices and standards. So scorecarding, cataloging, ownership, being able to say like, hey, how do we standardize all this stuff? How do we bring some consistency and make sure everybody's following everything? So it's kind of like developer portal, catalog type thing is super important. And then there's like incident management tools, whether it's like Fire Hydrant, Rootly, Incident.io, things that are more, I think, for mature organizations that are trying to drive more consistent incident management processes. That's kind of like one layer on top of all that in terms of more of a developer SRE experience type platform. So those are kind of the buckets of categories of tools I would recommend. I would say there's like SLO tools out there as well, things like Noble 9 and stuff like that. But I think most organizations are probably not mature enough to kind of go into an SLO platform. They can probably make a lot of use out of their observability platform. I was like, to Jeff's point, keep it simple, define your SLOs and alerts in your observability platform. Start there, start small, and then as you grow, you can mature into other, SLO tools. But you probably don't need anything like that to start with.
All right. Jeff, I'm sure you've seen a number of people go down the path to creating an SRE and implementing these processes. What's that one thing you've seen people do over and over again that just makes you shake your head and go, maybe that's not the way to go?
Starting off too big. Just keep it small. Keep it really small. That you're trying to take a look at how you're trying to build that organization. Don't over-architect it. Take a look at the small problems. What are you trying to solve? Ask those problems and then work on those small point solutions. Don't make the big picture the goal immediately. Take a look at the smaller issues along the way.
Ganesh, do SREs make more than everybody else in their IT organizations? I mean, that's part of the motivation for folks, right? Compensation drives behavior. There's a lot of responsibility and stress here. Is the reward there? Ganesh, you're...
Oh, sorry. I've got multiple mute buttons. Yeah, I would say compensation for SRE is definitely growing over time, and I think part of that is because people are starting to be more painfully aware of the complexities involved in a successful SRE function. So I think compensation is definitely going up over time, but honestly, probably competitive with any other engineering function that's in like a modern engineering organization.
All right. Jeff, you seeing the same thing? I mean, are SREs, getting the rewards they deserve as kind of the high priest/priestess of the IT world that they might be?
Tough for me to give you an answer there, Mike. I've kind of been in the basement for a long time, working in the bits and bytes and working on the development systems and pipelines. But as I like to tell my wife, even if I'm not qualified to answer this question, I'm going to go ahead and give you my opinion anyway. What I have seen definitely in the organizations that I've worked at, those SREs can make a huge difference. Those are the people that are the generalists are very important. And I don't want to take anything away from developers who are very concentrated on the features that they create, but someone who is an SRE who can bounce between many different functions, who can kind of be that glue to keep things together, I think they're critical, and I think that we're going to see their importance grow over time.
Ganesh, are we having this conversation with the wrong people? And what I mean by that is, I think, IT folks would understand the role of SRE. They kind of get it, but the people who hire the IT people and the SREs, maybe not so much. So do we need to kind of go have conversations with the C-level and the folks who are going to fund this and say, this is why you need one of these?
Yeah, I think it comes down to business impact. And there's a question in the chat here on how do we convince people to look at SLOs, right? I think that question relates to the question you're asking now is how do we get people to understand at the C-suite or the VP level about why SRE is so important? I think it very much starts with dollars, as do many things, but talking about hey, why is reliability important to us? And I think most executives understand to some degree or another that reliability matters to the bottom line. And as an executive, that's probably what they're thinking about. And so starting there saying hey, reliability really matters to us. Yes. Okay. Well, how do we increase reliability? How do we make things more resilient? And you start listing out hey, these are all the things that need to happen for our software to be more resilient. And they realize, well, we can't just make this happen magically. We need people who are good at this. We need people who can help us scale this across the organization. Help people understand what reliability is and best practices, and drive this kind of response. And then people start to realize, oh yeah, that makes total sense. You have specialists in security who are helping, resolve vulnerabilities and triage issues on the security side. Why is reliability and incidents no different? It's the exact same thing on different sides of the equation. I think those are great ways of having those conversations. It really comes down to business impact and what that organization is looking for. And that's how VPs care. And then that's how VPs and execs will then drive that to the rest of the development organization of hey, here's how I figured out that SRE is so important. Hey, go listen to the SREs that are telling you these things about best practice and standards and why that's so important.
Jeff, to that end, do we need SRE certificates and make that part of the whole motion for hiring folks? Or there are a lot of folks in IT that hate certificates. So, what's your sense of, do we need or necessary evil, or where are we?
Oh boy, that's a good one. I'm not a huge fan of certificates, but I know that they have their place. And I think that you can have a great SRE who doesn't have a certificate. You know who the people are who are contributing, but a certificate is also something that can really help, that you've gone through the necessary courseware, you've learned certain tactics that are going to help you. So is it a necessary evil? Probably. I think so. But I think the key is just to know that the people who are contributing, the people that know how to do that role, they're going to be recognized. Your question is really about, are we having the conversation with the wrong people? I think the C-suite sees the people who are contributing, what they're doing. And I think what we want to make sure that we do is with those SREs, we're able to give them a place where they can provide all of their data in a big picture where teams can see. And I know we're talking a little bit about developer portals today. That's the data that you want to bring back to the C-suite, where they can see not just a specific slice of what's going on, but the bigger picture. So SREs who are going to be skilled at that are going to be able to collect and present that data, whether it takes a certificate or not. I don't think that's a necessary piece of it.
Ganesh, what do you think? Do you guys look for certificates when you're going through the hiring process, or is it more word of mouth and who do you know and who vouches for who?
I think it's more. We don't look at certificates, but to Jeff's points, I think we look for knowledge, and I think that's why things like these forums are so important to understand. Like, why is reliability important? How do you drive reliability? System design. We really care. If you can go through a system design interview and walk us through your incident management process, and even like your painful experiences that you've had in the past with incidents, that's going to be much more important to us than certificate that says that you theoretically know these things, and being able to reason about it and drive this kind of behavior is much more important. And so, yeah, not as much focused on certifications. Definitely not like who you know, but it's more about what do you know and can you apply it.
But I would also add, it is also who you know, because in this business, there's still a lot of recommendations coming from people. Yes. If you work with someone who you trust and that person says this person's really good, I think that means a lot more than a certificate.
All right. We have a sister organization we work with called the DevOps Institute, where I think they do certificates over there for that question from one of our attendees. You might want to check them out. I know there's other places out there, to be fair to everybody. But yeah, there's a lot of SRE certificate programs these days. Gentlemen, Jeff, last 4 minutes or so, 2 minutes each. What's your best advice to folks as you kind of look at all the questions and where we are? What's that one thing you would leave people with?
Yeah, I think the question is what makes a great SRE? And I kind of go back to that analogy to working in the ER, that you're going to have to be prepared, but you have to be humble. You have to be prepared to say, I don't know. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in this industry, is that it's tough to say when you don't know something. And it's like, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, and you have to feel comfortable being able to say that you don't know something. And an SRE, there's probably something every day that they don't know. And that's what makes them great, is because they're learning so much, and then something comes up that day, they don't know it. They find a way that they're going to be able to learn it, whether it's the network of people that they know, the tool set that they use. They're able to comfortably say, I don't know, but they're also able to lean back on their experience and say, you know what, there was a whole bunch of stuff I didn't know a week ago or a month ago or 2 months ago, and I have learned that. So I feel okay when an issue comes up that I don't know it, that I can proceed from there. So I think that's the biggest advice that I would give, is that you're going to face calamities. It's going to be crazy. You've got the skill that you start to build up over time dealing with those issues. You've dealt with them before. You're going to deal with them going forward. So be comfortable with that.
All right, Jeff just described everybody's ideal spouse, but Jeff, what's your sense of what's your best advice to folks?
Mine would be start small. It's going to be very easy to get bogged down in all the details and all the responsibilities of being an SRE. And I think just staying really focused, and it kind of relates to Jeff's answer. I think, having a clear focus of what you're trying to accomplish and making very clear steps towards that versus, I think, getting just bogged down in the chaos that I think the role can be. That would be my best advice, is like, slow down, go slow to go fast. That's the best thing an SRE can do.
Gentlemen, thank you. I'm going to hand it back to Jared. And I guess the word of the day is don't stress yourself out.
Excellent. Thank you, Ganesh, Jeff, and Mike, for taking the time to join our discussion and share all your expertise with us. Just want to remind everybody that today's session was recording. Following the panel, you will receive an email with a link to view the recording on demand. You can also go to devops.com/webinars and get any of our on-demands there, this one included, anytime you want. Now for the 4 gift card winners that I promised at the beginning of the program. We have Emily H., Ken S., Rebecca B., and Cheryl A. Please be sure to keep an eye on your inbox. Also make sure to check your spam if it doesn't come in, but I'd like to congratulate you on winning those gift cards. On a final note, don't forget Phil, you'll have a pop-up as soon as this program closes out, where we'd like to know what you thought of the program, what we can do next time, and just help us improve. Again, Mike, Jeff, Ganache, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Everyone, you may now disconnect.